Your lecturer is Professor Paul Rosenzweig. Professor Rosenzweig is a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School, where he lectures on cybersecurity law and policy. He is a cum laude graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Rosenzweig is the founder of Red Branch Consulting, PLLC, a homeland security consulting company, and a senior advisor to the Chertoff Group. He formerly served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and he is currently a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Homeland Security Studies and Analysis Institute. Professor Rosenzweig is a senior editor of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy and the author of the recently released Cyber Warfare: How Conflicts in Cyberspace Are Challenging America and Changing the World.
In July 2010, a small computer security firm in Belarus announced that they'd discovered the signature of a new piece of malicious computer software, what we call malware. They gave this new virus an unassuming name, rootkit.temphider. And yet, despite the seemingly innocuous name, this piece of malware was something brand new. Some have called it the world's first cyber-guided missile. The way this new type of cyber threat has transformed the world, and quite possibly changed your life, is the subject of this course. Thank you for joining me as we explore what you need to know about cybersecurity. Together, over the next 18 lectures, we will be learning about the exciting and scary world of cybersecurity. What you'll come to see is that rootkit.temphider is really just the tip of the iceberg. Now, when the Belarus announcement was made, it was nothing unusual, hardly nice. After all, Symantec, that's the large cybersecurity firm that sells the Norton antivirus system, discovers more than 400 million new pieces of malware each year. That's for 2011. That's more than 12 new pieces of malware every second. Of course, most of what they look like and discover is simple. It looks a lot like older pieces of malware and is easily identified and rendered harmless. But this new virus, which eventually became known by the name of Stuxnet, was different, very different. In fact, it was so different that we find ourselves staring into a great unknown, just as those who invented air flight or the atomic bomb could not anticipate the consequences of those new technologies. So too, Stuxnet is, I think, the harbinger of a changed world. Understanding why that is so is really the entire purpose of this course. In this series of lectures, we will, I think, frighten you a bit as we describe all of the malicious actors in cyberspace, but also, I hope, encourage you by describing how security measures are trying to keep up with the bad actors. At the end, you may be a little wary. The bad actors are still winning today, but you'll understand that the contest isn't hopeless. So let's start with Stuxnet itself. Up until the Stuxnet software was developed, the mantra of many experts was that the effects of cyber conflicts would be restricted to the cyber domain. As one wag put it, cyber war only kills a bunch of little baby electrons. Stuxnet showed the world that cyber war could potentially kill real babies. What Stuxnet did was infect a physical manufacturing plant, in this case, the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, Iran, and make it malfunction. Using only a cyber virus, Iran's adversary made the machines break down. That's scary, because while Stuxnet only disrupted a uranium purification system, there's nothing at all that limits a cyber assault to uranium purification. The same type of system that runs the Iranian centrifuges also runs the systems that control the heat of their nuclear reactors. It is theoretically no harder to cause the centrifuges to break down than, say, to have graphite control rods pulled out, causing a nuclear meltdown. And if the Iranian facility at Natanz is vulnerable, so is the electric grid in New York City, or the Colorado River's Hoover Dam. Stuxnet was a piece of software code. At bottom, it was just a string of ones and zeros like any other program. Except, of course, this one was malevolent. Stuxnet used what experts call a two-phase attack. In other words, it had two parts. The first part was malware that infected a Windows-based Microsoft operating system. If you run Windows on your computer, then in theory, your computer was also a potential target. So let's call this the delivery phase of the program. The purpose of this delivery phase was to put the attack program in a system that might someday be attached to the target's control system. From this delivery platform, the malware was designed to jump to infect what is known as a SCADA system, a supervisory control and data acquisition system. In this case, one manufactured by Siemens, the German manufacturing giant. In fact, Stuxnet targeted a very specific type of SCADA system software, the S7400 PLC software. And PLC, by the way, stands for Programmable Logic Controller. That's the generic name for the type of software controller that's used to operate large-scale machinery operations worldwide. Now, when Stuxnet jumped from the Microsoft operating system to the SCADA system, this was the attack phase of the program. The entire program required two phases for its attack because, not surprisingly, many SCADA systems that run sensitive or secret machinery are not directly connected to the internet. A direct connection makes a system more vulnerable to intrusion, so operators add an additional layer of security by creating an air gap, that is, making sure that there are no connections between the system and the internet. The Iranian nuclear enrichment program was almost certainly air-gapped from the broader internet. So Stuxnet must have entered the SCADA system through some interaction it had with an external Windows-based program. Nobody quite knows how that happened. Perhaps it was introduced into the control program when an engineer hooked up a Windows-based tablet to collect data for diagnostic purposes. Perhaps it was on one of these, a thumb drive that was mistakenly plugged into a Windows operating interface system. Or, more creatively, it might have been introduced on purpose by a spy who infiltrated the facility for the purpose of introducing the worm into the system. Personally, I kind of enjoy that cloak and dagger image, especially when combined with the high-tech idea of a computer virus. In truth, though, we'll probably never know for sure. Whatever the method of introduction, the second phase of the attack demonstrated a large degree of sophistication. It was designed to target only a single, particular type of operating system, a bit like a precision-guided missile seeking a specific house to bomb. And in identifying its target within the Iranian nuclear enrichment facility, Stuxnet's developers exhibited a significant degree of insider knowledge. They knew exactly what to attack and how to do so. Before we discuss the actual target, however, we have to back up just a bit and talk about uranium and enrichment. As you probably remember, back around 2008 and 2009, many in the West became concerned that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon. It probably still is. That effort, combined with its rather extreme rhetoric, raised the hackles of many in the West. It turns out that the uranium that occurs in nature isn't pure enough to work as a nuclear fuel in a reactor, and it also isn't pure enough to work as an explosive material for an atomic bomb. Uranium ore has to be purified to be of real value, and one part of the process of purification requires that a bunch of centrifuges spin at a constant rate of speed. And when we say constant, we mean really, really constant, with very little variation. So it isn't surprising that we use computers, these SCADA systems we've been talking about, to precisely control the speed of the rotors that spin the nuclear centrifuges. When they work right, these SCADA systems can be very precise. The Stuxnet attack changed all that. It manipulated the speed of the centrifuge rotors to make them slow down and then speed up. The variations in speed were designed to slowly wear down and ultimately crack the rotors. Because Stuxnet made the centrifuges run at a highly variable rate, the uranium produced was impure and unsuitable for use. Along the way, Stuxnet also disabled and bypassed several digitally operated safety systems that were designed to make sure that the centrifuges ran at a fixed and safe rate of speed. It's worth pausing for a minute to think about this, because it really is something new and different. Here we have a piece of computer malware having a real-world effect. In this case, the real-world effect was to break some rotors in a centrifuge. But once we start down that road, well, almost anything is possible. Any physical system that is operated by a computer system like the SCADA system is at least now theoretically vulnerable to attack and possible destruction. And perhaps not so theoretically. In 2007, the Department of Homeland Security ran a test at one of our national labs in Idaho. The test was known as Aurora, and it involved a malicious computer program. The program worked on a diesel generator, one that isn't too different from the diesel generators used in electricity generating facilities all across America, and in fact, across much of the world. There's a video of the test, and it's really quite incredible. During the test, nobody touches the generator physically. But by the end of the test, black smoke is pouring from the machine. That's definitely not what the engineers had in mind for this piece of machinery. What happened was that the Idaho computer scientists put some malware into the SCADA program. Not Stuxnet, but a moderately close cousin probably. And instead of breaking rotors, they made the generator run itself to death and burn itself out. Now that's pretty scary. Between Aurora and Stuxnet, you can understand why policymakers, lawyers, military leaders around the globe are concerned. Not only did Stuxnet have physical effects, it also hid them. Stuxnet was a surreptitious piece of malware. Buried within the program was a pre-recorded series of data reports on the operation of the centrifuges. Now, of course, SCADA systems regularly provide reports to the operators about how the machinery is working. While Stuxnet was causing the centrifuges to operate poorly, it was using pre-recorded data to falsely report to the operators that everything was in working order. Think of the movie Ocean's 11, where the robber heroes play a pre-recorded tape of what is happening in the vault they're robbing to cover their true activities, and you get an idea of how the Stuxnet worm covered its tracks. Iran has, understandably, been unwilling to say much publicly about how badly it was hurt by Stuxnet. At a minimum, confirmed reports suggest that the malware destroyed 1,000 centrifuges at the Natanz facility. One Israeli analyst told the Jerusalem Post that Stuxnet may have set the Iran nuclear program back by at least 2 years. Of course, as in the real world, sometimes even the most precise missiles cause some collateral damage. Though Stuxnet was targeted at the Iranian Natanz nuclear processing facility, according to Symantec, that's the computer security firm, by September 29, 2010, there were 100,000 computer servers infected with Stuxnet in the world. Now, approximately 60% of those were in Iran. The next 5 countries to experience the most Stuxnet infections were Indonesia, India, the United States, Azerbaijan, and the United Kingdom, respectively. But all things considered, the targeting was pretty precise. The only place where the virus actually turned on and broke things, at least the only place we know about, was at Natanz. So, who did it? At least on the official record, nobody knows for sure. There's been no decisive demonstration of attribution of responsibility for the Stuxnet malware. But there's been a lot of educated, and maybe less than educated, speculation. For example, some people think that there are hints about the authorship of the worm buried in the malicious code itself. Pieces of evidence that allegedly are signatures demonstrating that Israel wrote the Stuxnet code. One piece of evidence is the prominence within the code of the number 19790509, which, when you invert it, might be a reference to the date May 9, 1979, which happens to also be the day a prominent Iranian Jew was executed by Ayatollah Khomeini's government. Indeed, if this were a mystery novel, then the Israelis would have the means, motive, and opportunity to have committed the crime. And they have a powerful incentive to degrade Iranian nuclear progress. But so do others, including the United States. In fact, the New York Times reported that the two countries actually cooperated in the production of Stuxnet, using American know-how to build the worm and then test it at Israel's Dimona complex in the Negev desert. According to the New York Times, the Stuxnet worm was tested on centrifuges identical to those at the Natanz nuclear facility that the United States got from Libya. One other indicator: Stuxnet may have been just the last phase of a larger sabotage program known as FLAME. According to a 2012 report in the Washington Post, the United States and Israel jointly developed FLAME to collect intelligence in preparation for the Stuxnet cyber sabotage attacks. This massive piece of malware, it's the largest we've ever seen, was designed to secretly map Iran's computer networks and monitor the computers of Iranian officials, sending back a steady stream of intelligence. Apparently, someone used that information to make sure that Stuxnet hit its target. And here's the fun part. Although FLAME came first in time, Stuxnet was discovered first by outsiders. Now, that's confusing, isn't it? Okay, so what's the big deal? Cyber viruses can have real-world effects. Is that really any different than what, say, a grenade or a mortar attack can do? Maybe not. But from another perspective, this change in capabilities may be as world-shaking, metaphorically speaking, of course, as the explosion of the first atomic bomb. When in July 1945, the first experimental bomb was exploded, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who led the Los Alamos development efforts, immediately recognized the significance of the event. As he recounted some years later in an interview, quote, "We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that, one way or another." But even Oppenheimer barely understood the significance of the changes that arose from the first atomic bomb. At the time, he recognized its destructive power and the transformative effect it would have on war-making, but nobody could, at the dawn of the nuclear age, anticipate its long-term social, psychological, and geopolitical effects. Looking back now, with the perspective of more than 65 years, we can see some of those changes. From the first atomic bomb came nuclear power and cheaper electricity. But it also brought us new ways of thinking about war, like the concept of mutually assured destruction, the counterintuitive idea that world peace is better maintained through the hyper-development of destructive capacity. This led to the equally counterintuitive view that defense is destabilizing. If missile defenses work, then mutually assured destruction doesn't. As a result, we concluded that defending yourself was dangerous and maybe even immoral. We effectively banned all defensive technologies through the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In the broader field of world geopolitics, nuclear weapons also wrought unexpected changes. In an extended sense, the existence of atomic weapons mandated a policy of containment rather than confrontation, since nuclear war was too grave to risk. And from the policy of containment flowed the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and ultimately limited wars in Korea and Vietnam. Now, at the beginning of the nuclear era, all of these developments were unanticipated glimmers on the far horizon, unseen by anyone who witnessed the first atomic explosion. Atomic weapons were utterly transformative. Cyberspace is no different. We've had an easy, some would say too easy time, exploiting the benefits of the internet. Now, however, it seems as though the vulnerabilities threaten to overwhelm the benefits. The internet is a bit of a wild and dangerous place where our secrets and even our identities are increasingly. Viruses like Stuxnet that threaten our critical infrastructure are but the most extreme example of those vulnerabilities. Like the explosion of the atomic bomb, we can't even begin to predict what the future holds. But events like Stuxnet tell us that the changes will be very great indeed. Stuxnet was a proof of concept that cyber war can be real. And as the Department of Homeland Security has noted, now that information about Stuxnet is publicly available, it's a lot easier for other bad actors to develop variants that target other SCADA systems around the world. Because SCADA systems are pervasive and generic, the Stuxnet worm is, essentially, a blueprint for a host of infrastructure attacks. The American demonstration that nuclear weapons were capable of manufacture assured the Soviets that their efforts would eventually succeed. Similarly, the proof through Stuxnet that cyber attacks can have kinetic effects has opened up a whole world of possibilities for malware designers. Many of those possibilities are potentially catastrophic. If you doubt the last proposition, consider that the largest SCADA system in the world is run by Gazprom, the massive Russian gas and oil producer. That ought to give anyone pause. Imagine what would happen if someone used a Stuxnet variant to destroy the pipeline system that ships oil and gas to Europe, or to blow up the largest Russian petroleum processing plant. Or think of this possibility. Maybe Stuxnet wasn't really intended to have that great an effect. Maybe the damage to Iran's nuclear program was just a useful collateral benefit to a larger purpose, that of sending a message to the Iranians that even their most sensitive programs were vulnerable. This is sometimes called an info hack, where the purpose is more to let your opponent know that he is vulnerable, and therefore should be cautious and circumspect in his actions, than it is to achieve any particular result. Indeed, some strategic cyber analysts are convinced, albeit without any direct evidence, that Stuxnet was not the only payload delivered to the Iranian systems. After all, having gone to the significant effort of getting inside the Iranian system, why stop at disrupting the uranium enrichment centrifuges? A sensible adversary may have left behind other payloads with the capability of far more significant disruptions. Payloads that are virtually impossible to detect and scrub from an existing control system. The most profound similarities between atomic weapons and cyber threats, however, lie in the disruptive nature of the Stuxnet event. Imagine what it must have been like the day after the first atomic bomb was exploded. Around the globe, settled assumptions about war, policy, foreign affairs, and law had, in an instant, all come unglued. Even 17 years after the atomic bomb was first exploded, the uncertainty about their use and the threat they posed was so great that the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly engulfed the world in nuclear war. We're about to experience that same sort of tumultuous time. And as of the date of this lecture, nobody in America, except a very few people who are concerned senior policymakers, really knows it. Furthermore, and perhaps more ominously, even at the dawn of the nuclear age, we were confident that we could identify anyone who used atomic weapons, and that they could all be peer nation-state actors. In the cyber realm, by contrast, we have much greater difficulty identifying who fires the weapon. And indeed, the culprit may well be a non-state actor, perhaps terrorists, or even a relatively small group of dedicated hackers of the sort we'll talk about in later lectures. It's difficult, if not impossible, to know for sure. In short, we stand on the threshold of a new world, much like we did in 1945. And from this vantage point, nobody can really say where the future might lead. But what we can say is that the changes that lie ahead will affect everyone on the planet in ways great and small. And that means that the more you know about where we are today, the better prepared you will be for the future. The binary system of counting, which uses ones and zeros, lies at the heart of the cyberspace revolution. Every number, every bit of data, every voice communication, every video can in essence be expressed as a string of ones and zeros. In physical terms, deep within the innards of the computer, silicon chips create those ones and zeros through a series of transistors whose structure is etched into wafer-thin silicon integrated circuits. The beauty of cyberspace and its genius lies in recognizing the universal power of these simple ones and zeros. The rapidity with which they can be manipulated has, over the past decades, increased exponentially. And that explosion in computing power has fostered a wild explosion of new technology. Hardly a day goes by without some development of some new computer application that is intended to enhance our lives. Indeed, they've become so ubiquitous that we now have a shorthand word for them. We call them apps. America's increasing utilization of, reliance on, and dependence upon technology for our social infrastructure is changing how we live our lives. We even have things like Cyber Monday for our Christmas shopping. The pace of our technological advances has significant implications for how individuals interact, for how the economy functions, for how the government and the private sector conduct business, and ultimately for how we protect our national interests and provide for our common defense. Cyberspace is everywhere, and it's part of our everyday activities. But precisely because it's so pervasive, that means that our dependence on cyberspace creates new risks and dangers. If you want a shorthand way of thinking about this course, it's about our struggle to have our cake and eat it too, about how we try to reap the benefits in productivity and information sharing that come from a globalized web of cyber connections, while somehow managing to avoid, or at least reduce, the damage done by the bad actors who seek to exploit that globalized web for their own reasons. Like most efforts to eat cake without gaining weight, our labors cannot reasonably be expected to be fully successful. So our struggle can only be to minimize the threats as best we can while maximizing the benefits. This struggle is the newest conflict for the current generation. The nature of that conflict changes on a daily basis. But unless something deeply surprising happens, the specter of cyber warfare and the reality of a broader cyber conflict, which includes espionage, terrorism, and crime, are all with us for the foreseeable future. Of course, in cyberspace, things change all the time. So some of the specifics we talk about may be overtaken by events by the time you take this course. But the fundamental premise of this course is that it will not become dated. The enduring principles that underlie our struggle, the need to identify risks and minimize them while maximizing our benefits, those won't change. So this course will proceed in a relatively simple fashion. We're going to begin, appropriately enough, at the beginning. We'll start with a look at how the internet and cyberspace are built and why they are built the way they are. It turns out that a lot of the vulnerability is built into the system from the start. We'll also spend some time looking more closely at the different types of viruses and vulnerabilities that are infecting the cyber domain. And we'll close the introductory portion of this course by trying to get a different feel for who the different actors are in cyberspace. There is a world of difference between the motivations of, say, China or the United States and those of cyber hackers. And both of them are very different from organized crime. In the second part of the course, we'll start to look at some of the issues of law and policy that are bound up in our dealing with these threats. We'll look, for example, at how the Constitution both protects our civil liberties and possibly limits our ability to protect ourselves. We'll ask some questions about encryption policy as a way of protecting ourselves. And we'll take a dive into the topic known as big data, the idea that everyone leaves a cyber trail in cyberspace for others to see and use. The third and last part of the course steps back a bit from our look at particular policies and tries to put the problem in context. We'll look at how to make the entire network more resilient. I'll give you some tips on how to best protect yourself. And finally, we'll do some crystal ball gazing and look at what the next 10 or 20 years may hold for us. And at the end of it all, Stuxnet may still scare you, but you'll have a better idea of exactly why it's scary and what we, collectively, are trying to do about it. You will, I hope, understand that it is impossible to eliminate all the risks of cyberspace. There are no silver bullets out there. All we can do is recognize the incredible value of cyberspace and accept the risks that come with it, all the while working to manage those risks and minimize them as best we can. So, welcome on board. I hope you enjoy the journey. Every minute of every day, roughly 3 million Google searches are done. In that same minute, 12 different websites are hacked. The scope of the internet is immense, and you really can't understand cyber vulnerabilities, cybersecurity, and cyber warfare if you don't understand how cyberspace is built and why it works the way it does. So that's what we're going to explore in this lecture. And as an added bonus, we'll also consider some of the amazing ways in which cyberspace is used today. To be honest, it's pretty incredible. To begin with, to a very real degree, much of what we consider a vulnerability in the system is inherent in its design. Indeed, the internet is so effective precisely because it is designed to be an open system. And while that makes the internet readily accessible, it also makes it highly vulnerable. As David Post explained in his wonderful book, In Search of Jefferson's Moose, Notes on the State of Cyberspace, the networks that make up cyberspace were built for ease of communication and expansion, not for security. At its core, the logic layer of cyberspace, which we'll discuss more in a few minutes, is fundamentally very dumb. It's designed to do nothing more than transfer information, or if you prefer, data, from one place to another, very quickly and very efficiently. This fundamental simplicity is the key to understanding cyberspace. In particular, even though many users tend to think of cyber connections as nothing more than a glorified telephone network, the two are, in fact, structurally very, very different. The telephone networks are hub and spoke systems with the intelligent operation at the central switching points. Phone calls come in from a user to a central switching system where sophisticated switches route calls from one caller to the other, creating a single end-to-end connection. Indeed, early on, at the dawn of the telephone system, the intelligence at the hub of the telephone networks was human. Just think of the old TV shows and movies where human operators sit in front of large boards, moving plugs around and requiring the physical connections to be made. That structure also means that all the control of the system is, in effect, with the central authority. And that is also where the vulnerabilities are. For example, think of the vulnerability of having your phone call intercepted. In the world of telephone communications, intercepting a communication was as simple as going to the central switching station and attaching 2 alligator clips to the right wire, hence the word wiretapping. And if you want to join the telephone network, you can't just join. You, in effect, need someone's permission. If you want a phone number, you have to wait for the phone company to come out, assign you one, and hook you up. And if you want to add a new function, say call forwarding or or a caller ID, you need to call the phone company and have it added to your account. The centralized system controls your access and your services. Communications through cyberspace are completely different. Though portions of them, especially the last mile to your house, often travel over telephone lines. Put simply, there really isn't any central place to go on the network, and there is no central authority that runs it. Let's take a look at the structure that cyberspace has given us. When we talk colloquially of cyberspace, almost everyone is talking about the logical network layer, where all the information gets exchanged. If you tried to map all those connections, it would look just like a tangle of lines, almost like a giant web built by a crazy spider. Several years ago, some researchers tried to map this web. The result was the famous Peacock map, a wild depiction of all the network connections between servers that transmit data in cyberspace. We call that transmission space the logic layer of the network because all it does is transmit the logical information, that is, the ones and zeros of the network. Now, the researchers gave the map some false colors, hence the name, but the colors weren't at all significant. They were just added to give the map some structure. The map itself had no structure at all, only a few bright hotspots where high-level servers switched a lot of traffic in transit. A map of the logic layer today would look very similar. It's still a web, but also completely different, since the connections on the network are ever-changing. What this type of map shows is that the internet is this vast switching system for the distribution of information at near instantaneous speeds across great distances. So, how do the ones and zeros move around in this logic layer? Unlike the telephone system, where the information all stays together in a single unit as it moves from one end of the conversation to the other, in the logic layer of cyberspace, the information is broken up into small packets. These packets are separately transmitted along different routes and then reassembled when they arrive at the destination. Thus, by contrast with the phone network, the cyberspace network is truly a web of interconnected servers that do nothing more than switch packets of information around the globe. And when we say web here, we mean that as a descriptive term. That's how the interconnections are mapped. The web is, as we shall see, far broader than the World Wide Web of web pages that you can navigate to. It's a much vaster web of interconnections of everything, ranging from cars and power plants to web pages and cell phones. Doing that requires very little intelligent design. All that is needed, to simplify matters a fair bit, is an addressing system, so that everyone has an address on the web and a protocol on how to move information from one address to the other. The addressing system is known as the Domain Name System, or DNS, and the transmission protocol is known as the Internet Protocol Suite, or more commonly, the TCP/IP, which derives its name from two of the most important protocols in it, the Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, and the Internet Protocol, IP. That's also where the idea of an IP address comes from. So if you want an analogy, you can think of the DNS system as the Yellow Pages, a place you can go to look up someone's address. And the Internet protocols, they're the rules about how to share information, including the address, with everyone. For example, in our mail system, we put the return address in the top left corner. That's a rule. And the address to which the mail is supposed to be delivered in the center, with the zip code at the end. That's another rule. And everybody around the globe knows these rules, so that mail addressed in, say, South Africa is written in the exact same way as mail addressed in, say, Russia. We also have a set of rules about the size of envelopes and what they can and cannot contain, so on. The TCP/IP system is really just that, a set of rules or protocols about how to identify the address of information in transit and also how to package that information. But that's really it. For the innards of the working of the network, we could spend a lot of time talking about the technical specifications, but in the end, they aren't particularly relevant to our discussion. What is relevant, and the takeaway point going forward, is that so long as a user follows the TCP/IP protocols, his information will be delivered. And that's true whether it's Aunt Tilly's apple pie recipe or the code to launch a nuclear attack. The logic layer is only ones and zeros being directed around the network, and nothing more. So the real intelligent operations of this network occur at the edges, in our mobile devices and laptops, the ones that run the various apps. You can, quite literally, hook onto the network any system that manipulates data in any way and outputs data as its product. You can be sure that it will work because you will know that the ones and zeros will come to you in a format that you can recognize and use. And you can also be sure that the ones and zeros you send back will be delivered to whoever you're communicating with if you send them in the same universal format using the same addressing system. And that's what makes the internet so successful. Access to it is not controlled at a central switching point. You don't need permission to add a new functionality. The way the internet is built, anyone with a new idea can design it and add it to the network by the simple expedient of purchasing a domain name and renting server space. The addressing directory, the domain name system, that allows information to be correctly routed is operated on a distributed basis that no one person really controls. And so long as you use the commonly accepted addressing protocols, virtually any function can be added to the web. A store, a virtual world game site, or a giant government database. This flexibility is precisely what has driven the explosive, almost wild growth of the internet. Today, there are more than 2.5 billion users worldwide because everyone and anyone can use the network how they want to. The simplicity of the system is why this particular type of internet became the internet. It was so easy to use that market forces worked and everyone came to agree that it would be the system of universal choice. Let me explain the power of the internet by giving you an example that, to my mind, is quite amazing and demonstrates the power and transformative nature of cyberspace. Consider a simple everyday occurrence. Imagine that you type into your search engine, and let's say it's Google, the search question, Yankee second baseman 1973. Here's what happens for you to get your answer to that query. First, that small text file is translated by your web browser into a string of ones and zeros for transmission across cyberspace. At the same time, another portion of your web browser recognizes that you're sending this search inquiry to Google and not, for example, to Yahoo or Bing, and it picks out the correct IP address to which your question should be addressed. The question is then broken up into several distinct packets of information for transmission, let's say a half dozen. Those half dozen packets each take a different track across the internet, only to be reassembled at a Google server. And even though the IP address to which the message was sent was registered by Google at their headquarters in Mountain View, California, the Internet Routing Protocol sends your message to the nearest Google server that's handling a comparatively lower load of traffic. Google has 6 data centers in the United States, so let's say your message arrived at the one in South Carolina. That's where the real magic begins. Up until now, the Internet protocols have simply served as an information transmission system. The intelligence, the massaging of your data and its interpretation, that happens at the endpoints, at the Google server farm. To begin with, your string of ones and zeros is translated back into your natural language text message. Then, sophisticated programs interpret that message, trying to figure out what it means. This natural language translation algorithm looks at the first word of the text message. It realizes that the word Yankee could mean the baseball team, or it could mean the people who live up in New England. It then looks at the next word, second, and it tries to figure out whether you're talking about the unit of time or the second of 2 items. The word baseman helps put the other 2 words in context. Perhaps the program even considers for a brief moment whether you misspelled the word basement with an ENT on the end, but it rejects that idea because in context, the word baseman makes clear what Yankee and second were about. So it reaches a judgment, which is almost never wrong, by the way, that it understands what your question is. Then it adds the year and interprets your query. Then Google applies its secret sauce. They have data processing algorithms that help identify which web pages are the most likely ones to have the answer to your question. Its ranking algorithms take into account factors like which pages people have clicked on when they ask similar questions, how often they did so, which pages have the highest traffic load from sites other than Google, and so on. Using its ranking system, the Google server then compiles a list of the most likely websites to have the answer to your query. That assembled list is immediately coded as a web page with rank ordering on the page from most to least likely useful. Then that entire page is again reduced to ones and zeros, broken up into dozens of packets, sent across the internet, and reassembled on your computer as a visible web page. And all of that happens in under a second. In fact, if you're like me, and the response from Google takes more than a second or two, it frustrates you. You feel like something isn't working right. I think when that happens, we sometimes forget what a revolution it is that you can get an answer to your question in a matter of moments without having to do anything other than type with your fingers on the keyboard. And so the web page comes back. And of course, the first link is the Baseball Almanac. If you click on it, you'll see that the Yankees' regular second baseman for 1973 was named Horace Clarke. He played 147 games at that position during the season. And instantaneously, you have your answer to a relatively obscure question. And that's what makes cyberspace so powerful. Google didn't need permission to provide this service to you. And you were free to choose someone other than Google if you wanted to. Yahoo or Bing, for example. And you didn't need to use Internet Explorer as your web browser. You could have used Safari if you're an Apple user, or Mozilla Firefox. You didn't need anyone's permission to choose which product to use. You didn't have to buy it from a centralized switching station. Nor did you have to ask permission to go and ask the question. Google services aren't some add-on that you have to purchase. Access comes because Google chooses to provide it. And you can use it simply by virtue of your connection to the network. The ability to choose your services, to choose your method of access, and to ask questions of a universal nature across the entire scope and domain of the world is what makes cyberspace truly a worldwide web of connections. The distributed structure of the network also means that anything can be a node in the network. That is, an endpoint where the network connects to a function of some sort. We tend to think of cyberspace as limited to connections between computers. Sometimes we also add, in our minds, cell phones as part of the network. But the truth is that anything with an addressable functionality, that means anything with an IP address and a chip, is somewhere on the cyberspace network. If your car has OnStar, it's on the network. If your house is one of those new wired houses, it's on the network. Likewise, all of the new smart grid electric meters are fundamentally part of the cyberspace network. Indeed, the new network of things is growing so quickly that we're running out of IP addresses. That's another topic for a later lecture. The problem with this interconnection is that all of these nodes are potentially quite vulnerable. And that's true whether the node is the Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz or the music system in your house. In theory, anything that is connected to the cyber network is subject to being hacked. Though I confess I'm at a loss right now to figure out what would be gained by hacking my music system. The other day, I saw a demonstration by a German company called HackerLab that showed the vulnerability of an iPhone. With malicious software installed on the phone, an outsider could turn the phone on without it ringing and make it into a microphone. Using the program, he could listen into any conversation within range of the iPhone's mic. The program was even sophisticated enough to link to the GPS tracking system in the phone so that it would turn on when the phone was, say, at work, where important business information might be discussed, but turn off when the phone was at the owner's home. In short, As former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense put it in a speech, quote, "The internet was designed to be open, transparent, and interoperable. Security and identity management were secondary objectives in systems design. This lower emphasis on security in the internet's initial design gives attackers a built-in advantage." End of the quote. We can think about the internet. When we think about the internet, we tend to think about the ones and zeros moving around in the logic layer and nothing else. But there's more to cyberspace than that. Understanding why is critical to really understanding the operation of the cyber domain. Remember the peacock map from just a few minutes ago? Imagine looking at that map and asking yourself the question, where am I? If you looked at a map of the physical world, you'd know your answer. But in the cyber domain, you really have no idea. So, to find ourselves in cyberspace, we need to expand our vision a bit. The interconnections that we've been talking about are part of the so-called logic layer, where the ones and zeros are transmitted from server to server. But this logic layer is only a piece of the puzzle. While most people think of cyberspace as limited to the internet, with its web of connections between computers, its full structure is really more complex. The logic layer is embedded in a much larger cyber domain, and that domain can be conceptualized as a 5-layer cake of connections. At the bottom of the cake is what we might call the geographic layer. That is the physical location of elements of the network. Though cyberspace itself has no physical existence, every piece of equipment that creates it is physically located somewhere in the world. One consequence of this is that the physical pieces of the network are subject to the control of many different political and legal systems. One of the issues we'll be talking about later in this course is precisely this problem. If you're an American user, what are the rules if you use your BlackBerry to communicate with someone in France or Germany? Whose law controls? Even though cyberspace has no physical nature itself, all of its pieces and every one of its actors has a physical location somewhere in a real-world country. The next layer up is the physical network layer. This layer reminds us that cyberspace is made up of hardware and infrastructure, all of which is connected together. The components we think of in this layer include all of the wires, the fiber optic cables, the routers, the servers, and the computers linked together across geographic spaces. To be sure, some of the links are through wireless connections, but all those connections have physical